everyone. So today I'll be talking about the soybean crop, which is actually the #1 genetically modified crop in the world, and it represents over half of worldwide biotech crop acreage with an 82% adoption rate among soy farmers. So it's become a huge part of our economy, kind of how we consume food, how we produce it, and it's really kind of made a really big difference in the argument with genetically modified foods. So I'll kind of go into like some background about the soybean crop first, sort of what it looks like, how it was produced. I'll go into some of like the genetic modifications and sort of how they did it. And then I'll go into like some pros and cons of genetically modified soybean plants and then a conclusion. So go ahead and get started. So due to its high oil and protein content, soy is actually cultivated for a variety of food purposes. So very minimal amounts of the soy that is genetically modified and cultivated we see on our shelves in stores. So we see obviously things like soy sauce, tofu, and then soy milk and things like that. But it's actually become a foundation for animal plants and feeds, and soy protein is added to bread and packaged goods. So that's kind of how we see it as far as our consumption. But there's also like a huge economic importance with the soybean crop in the industrial sector. So a big part of, which is kind of why I chose this topic in the first place, actually, because I thought it was extremely interesting that the soybean plant or crop, I guess, kind of makes such a big difference in all of these aspects of our economy and kind of our lives. So I'll talk about sort of how it affects the industry as well, or the industrial sector. So because it's so versatile, the U.S. soybean components make product applications remarkably wide-ranging in general. So honestly, like it's includes but not limited to rubber, fibers, coatings, solvents, plastics, lubricants, and adhesives. And actually high oleic soybean crops, excuse me, sorry, I'm not sure if I said that right, but high oleic soybeans are also able to remain stable at extremely high temperatures, which is key for the industrial sector. So manufacturers are actually using the soybean oil in place of some like petrochemicals and other things, so they're less dependent on these really harmful chemicals for our environment because they are able to use these soybeans. So that's kind of why soybeans are such a candidate for genetic modification in the first place. So in addition, just kind of to recap, in addition to being a source of oil and meal for human and animal consumption, also huge factors in the industrial sector, and is kind of a good substitute for biofuel and petrochemical as well. So that's kind of why this is such a big target for genetic improvement in the first place. And the US and Brazil are actually currently the world leading producers of soybeans. So most soybeans are processed for their oil and protein in the feed and animal industry, as I said before, and as was said in the video lectures. But like I said, again, a smaller percentage is used for human consumption and retail food products. So now I can get into a little bit more of the genetic engineering and modification of the soybean crop and kind of what that looks like, how it came about in the first place, who came up with this. So the first time a soybean transformation was reported was in 1988, and I'm going to talk about the Roundup Ready soybeans. So basically the Roundup Ready soybeans, which were mentioned a lot in the video lectures as well, are basically soybeans that are resistant to the chemicals in Roundup. So the chemicals in Roundup actually have glyphosate in it. So basically the whole purpose of Roundup is to get rid of weeds, which I'm sure most of us know that, and probably a lot of us have actually used it. So glyphosate can actually kill any plants just on contact because plants have this essential enzyme called EPSPS. So because of this essential enzyme that only plants have, basically without it, or if that enzyme was to be broken down, then we wouldn't have any more plants. All plants would die, is kind of the general I guess thing with that. So basically what scientists wanted to do was create a series of glyphosate resistant soybeans that are resistant to these chemicals in Roundup. So basically the soybeans can grow kind of without the threat of weeds coming in, and you can use Roundup to get rid of these weeds, but the soybeans can continue to grow and kind of prosper more, which will sort of increase the yields, increase the size and growth rates of the soybeans, kind of has a lot of positives as far as farming goes. So now I'll talk about more of the science part of this. So glyphosate kills plants by interfering with the synthesis of EPSPS in the plant, and it's actually considered essential because animals can't make EPSPS, only plants can. And like I said again, if this is interfered in plants or kind of taken away or killed, then the plant can't survive, which sort of creates a domino effect because then animals who consume these plants and rely on these plants in their nutrition and their kind of daily feed need to get this EPSPS in some way. And if the plants all die, then the animals will all die. And I'm sure we've all seen kind of just a natural food chain, how that works. This is extremely important. So it's huge that, scientists are kind of trying to find a way to make a plant resistant to this, resistant to glyphosate, I mean. So the glyphosate will interfere with the EPSPS in the plant. But the issue is that if we interfere and take it away, just to recap again, the plant will die. So what scientists did to get around this was they kind of use agrobacterium and the biolithic bombardment method to kind of artificially inject a virus into these plants and sort of make them resistant to this. So kind of the way they did it was they first took the EPSPS and put it into these plasmids. So after they put it into these plasmids, they kind of injected it into the soybean plants. So I can explain that a little more clearly, which will probably be easier. So basically we have like the DNA strand up here, like kind of so we have the promoter, and then we have like sort of the EPSPS coding region. So what happens is that the scientists they took the promoter and injected a virus into the promoter, and the promoter kind of is like the green light, like the come in, come out of the coding region where the EPSPS is in the DNA strand. So what they did was they actually attached a virus to the promoter and then fused it together. So then we have this fused gene with a viral promoter. So we kind of have a virus infused with the EPSPS. And so then what they did was they injected that into the plasmid. And then from the plasmid, they took it, so the plasmid with the virus, after it was already injected, and put it into the plant cell. So basically, these soybean plants, were actually growing with the virus of glyphosate inside of them. So then they kind of grew up with the resistance to it. So then the kind of immediate result of this was that the soybean plants grew up and they are resistant to glyphosate. So then kind of when you spray the plants with Roundup, all the weeds around it will die, but the plant will continue to grow and kind of be... and then this was actually patented and approved in 1996 by Monsanto, I believe is how you say it. And so kind of just going into this, even after 3 decades of stable transformations of Roundup-ready soybeans, they still can't really be considered routine just because it depends on the ability to combine efficient transformation and regeneration techniques effectively in the same way, and that kind of relies on a lot of outside environmental factors. So it's just kind of difficult to be consistent with this, and it's hard to have it down to an exact science. They still, like I said, started in 1988 and it's 2019, and they still are just kind of trying to find out best practices and how to be consistent with this process. So now I'll go into some of the positive effects of using genetically modified soybeans. So I kind of touched on a lot of these before, but I'll go a little more into it. So it does produce a higher crop yield. So farmers are being able to plant these Roundup Ready soybeans and get tons more out of it. They can make more profit, and it actually is good for the consumers and for the producers because they can make more money off of it, and we're getting more on our shelves. It also kind of improves shelf life and quality, which is kind of cool. So things like soy sauce, tofu, soy milk, other things that I mentioned before as well, are actually getting to stay on shelves longer and are at higher quality because we're not getting these weeds in the soybean plants and kind of these insects as well. So that was another thing, is that the soybean plants are actually insect resistant as well, these Roundup Ready soybeans. So kind of less viruses, less toxicity in general in the plants, which kind of translates to less toxicity and no viruses on our shelves and feeding our animals. And then there are also considerable environmental benefits. And this kind of, as far as environmental benefits go, it kind of goes both ways, where there's always positives and negatives when it comes to kind of the environment and how it affects it. So they in general take up less field space because the farmers know that they will get a higher yield. So they don't really have to worry about like the weeds and the insects being pests and kind of ruining their crop. So in general, farmers will get a higher yield from this, which is huge, again, for the producer and the consumer as well. And then I touched on this before as well, but industrial benefits. Manufacturers are much less dependent on petrochemicals and biofuels, which are horrible for the environment, and I think that's kind of known as well. But so they're kind of using the soybean plant as a good sort of something in replace of these harmful chemicals for our environment. So that's also helping as well. So those are some of the biggest positives, I would say. Just kind of getting higher yield is huge, and longer shelf life is huge as well. And that kind of goes into some of the sort of the following effects after that are things like world hunger, being able to put more things on our shelves, take up less space with things like the growing populations and growing industrial sector, even especially in third world and developing countries. That's huge, and that makes a really big difference. So now we went into some of the positives, so we're going to go into the negatives as well. So kind of one of the biggest first things is antibiotic resistance. So from that we get super weeds and super bugs. So this is this is already kind of happening, and we've seen this in fields as well. So super weeds and super bugs are kind of basically, so the soybean plant is resistant to glyphosate, and Roundup can spray all this down and kind of kill the weeds off. A result of this is just because because there's some crossbreeding as well with the plants and the weeds, and there is there's unintentional gene transfer to wild plants such as weeds. So because of that, then the weeds actually start to become resistant to glyphosate as well, and the bugs as well. So kind of a result of that is that the chemicals need to keep getting stronger, and the soybean plants need to continue to be injected with more and more of this glyphosate in the beginning, so then they can continue to be resistant to it as well. So Roundup keeps getting stronger. So we're kind of adding more and more chemicals just to kind of keep the soybean plants like one step above where the weeds are. And this can be a problem because at some point we lose the discretion basically of the soybean plant, where it just becomes this completely new genetically modified thing that we weren't expecting, and it wasn't intentional. So that's another big issue, and a lot of reason that there's a lot of backlash for genetically modified soybean plants. Another issue is that seeds from these plants can actually be blown into neighboring farms and can create sort of a domino effect of crossbreeding. So, for example, a farm that's maybe like a neighboring farm, he might be an organic farmer. And if, I'm a farmer here and I have genetically modified soybeans, and maybe it's a windy day, a lot of these farms are in the Midwest as well, so kind of a big gust of wind or a tornado can sort of bring my crops into this organic farmer's land and sort of ruin his harvest and ruin his crops. And then again, that kind of throws off the discretion of his farm and his soybean crops. So, and then it kind of, again, domino effect sort of results in several soybean plants that are genetically modified, and we sort of lose that discretion again. So, and even in the United States, as of right now, 94% of soybean plants, or crops, are genetically modified already. So, there's a really big chance that if this continues like at the rate that it's already going, then we will completely lose organic soybean crops, and we will only have the genetically modified version, which is just, it's kind of jarring to think about, honestly. And then there is potential toxicity, as the FDA does not regulate anything unless it is directly going on to the food shelf. So FDA doesn't regulate the soybean crops that are being